Deus, tama Deus, Maria. Tua para Deus, tama Deus, Maria. Pois para nós que grande alegria.
You've just heard violinist Justin Paul play music of the Portuguese Burghers near Trincomalee, Sri Lanka, from my field recordings from 1975. So grande alegria is what all of us feel in being here today, listening to performances and sharing musical soundscapes about the wider Iberian world and Lusosphere. Your presentations on the greater Iberian culture legacy from Brazil to Macau will contribute to our knowledge of histories and practices of music and performances, while debating the ongoing impact of Iberian seaborne expansion in shaping identities, social distinctions, and cultural expressions in global dimensions. A special welcome to Yale to our international guests, to co-organizers and participants from Columbia University, as well as the distinguished artists, musicians who have come for the evening of Indian ragas and talas and for Schroeder Sumba jazz. We owe an enthusiastic vote of thanks to all those whose ideas and dedication made this event possible, especially to Asia Nupani, Program Director of the Council on Latin American Iberian Studies. A grateful thank you to the Yale Institute of Sacred Music and to Evan Graves for technical support for the concert of Indian ragas, and to our many sponsors and co-sponsors listed in the program for making this conference a reality. Welcome to Iberian Soundscapes. I now have the pleasure of introducing Sunil Amrith, the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History and current chair of the South Asian Studies Council.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have been asked by David just to say a few welcoming words. And sadly, I will interloper here. I will not be able to join you, but it's just such a pleasure in my role as chair of the South Asian Studies Council to inaugurate an event which I think showcases the best of the Macmillan Center. I can't remember the last time I attended a workshop sponsored by so many different parts of Macmillan. Latin American Iberian Studies, African Studies, European Studies, South Asian Studies. I think this is just a wonderful convergence because of the work you're all doing, because of the rich and radically interdisciplinary work that you're doing, that we're able to bridge these geographies, but also in a very grounded way. This is not simply a conference about the global, this is a conference about the deep intersections of particular regional configurations as channeled through Iberian soundscapes. I'm really eager to see more events like this happen at Macmillan. I think many of us are working towards it, and you're really sort of leading the way with this. How wonderful to be collaborating with Columbia as well, and also with the Institute for Sacred Music. South Asian Studies Council is very proud to have been one of the supporting institutions of this meeting, and I wish you every success this afternoon and tomorrow. Thank you.
So from the Columbia side of things, I'd really like to thank David, Sunil, Inez, Giacomo, Asia, and the entire team here for making us feel so welcome already. Thank you. I also want to thank Isa and Ana Luisa from our side, from New York, for everything that they've done in terms of working with our collaborators and colleagues at Yale to make this such a seamless event. So thank you both very, very much. And last but not least, Anna Paulina Lee, my conspirator for many, many years now. Iberian Soundscapes is the last of a set of events and kind of connected events that we've been working on for the last 5 years. We started by thinking about very contemporary issues of built form, urbanity, precarity, and what we called various aspects of quote unquote slum life. As it were, we started, as I said, with something very contemporary as a way to think across Brazil and India and to think about colonialism and empire outside of the framework, certainly for me, outside the framework of British imperialism and colonialism, which is the way that I usually think about it. As we started working together and as we've been doing so, we've started scrolling further and further back into the past. And Iberian Moments and the Soundscapes is the end of a year-long set of events that we've been putting together. We had 2 small convenings looking at early modernity and forms of social distinction and difference as these emerged across the Iberian world, the Portuguese Empire. We were thinking at that time, and we continue to, about how identities are shaped, social distinctions emerge, and how they're imbricated with histories of merchant and commercial capitalism, but as well of connected histories of aesthetic production and performance. Working with the broad notion of Luso-Hispanic globality, which dates to the 15th century and beyond, we've been interested in thinking about how Luso-Hispanic trade relations, settlements, and intimacies constituted a critical aspect of Spanish and Portuguese colonial expansion to the Americas, Asia, and Africa. We've been especially keen to understand how Portuguese presence in South Asia markedly reshaped social structures of caste, gender, and religion, even as they set the terms by which new mixed-race communities would emerge in Southeast Asia or along coastal Africa, and how these processes related more broadly to the trade in human chattel and new extractive economies, that assemblage which today is referred to by the broad term racial capitalism, which effected an epochal geohistorical transition away from more dispersed and complexly organized social formations of early modernity. Neither of us are early modernists, and so for us it's been a new sandbox to play in. We've learned a lot from all of our collaborators and our colleagues. And as I said, Iberian Soundscapes is kind of the end of that road. Speaking of the road ahead, this is the road that ends here and moves into other spaces, I think. We're really thrilled to be here and very, very excited to see what happens over the next day and a half. So I think on behalf of Anna and I, thank you so much for traveling this road with us. And I think we're gonna get started, and we're gonna start with our keynote for today, which is gonna kind of inaugurate our convening and our time together today. It's my great, great pleasure to introduce Naresh Fernandes, who is a good friend, a colleague, a fellow traveler. Naresh is the founder and editor of Scroll.in, a digital news and culture publication that I think many of us know and read probably on a daily basis. He's the author of Taj Mahal Foxtrot, the story of Bombay's jazz age. His journalism has appeared in places too numerous to mention, and I won't do that here. He is also the author of City Adrift, a short biography of Bombay, which was published by Aleph in 2013, co-author of Bombay Then and Mumbai Now, a photo-led record of the city's historical and contemporary concerns. And in 2003, he co-edited, along with Jerry Pinto, a collection of essays, an anthology of writing, again, that many of you may know, called Bombay Meri Jaan. He's also contributed pieces to numerous volumes and publications. He's been a Poesis Fellow at the Institute of Public Knowledge at NYU and a member of the editorial policy board of the World Policy Journal. He was previously editor-in-chief of Time Out Mumbai and has worked at the Times of India and the Wall Street Journal. Please join me in welcoming Naresh.
I'm going to speak from here if that's okay, because I.
Ah, that's working. That's booming a little.
All right. Good afternoon, and thanks so much for having me here. As a journalist, I'm really honored to be among scholars who have read and admired for decades. So to kick this off, I think, and help me get over my nervousness, let's start with some song and dance. We're going to watch a clip from a film called Albela. It told the story of a poor man who dreams of making it big in the theater. Despite its rather unconventional leading man, a chap called Bhagwan, who usually played comic roles, Albela was one of the biggest film hits in Hindi film in 1951. This is a sequence from a tune called Deewana Parwana. In the initial few seconds, we'll see Bhagwan and the film's heroine, whose name is Geeta Bali, but it's really the musicians in the background who I am interested in. So that was Deewana Parwana, featuring the band led by a popular trumpet player whose stage name was Chick Chocolate. The film Albela became so popular that Chick's band, the music makers, began to wear those costumes in their stage performances too. In the 1940s and 50s, Chick and his band were ubiquitous. They performed regularly at the opulent Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay, the establishment of choice for the city's affluent. They were in the exclusive National Sports Club and at Hackman's Hotel in the Himalayan resort town of Mussoorie. The band was, as this clip attests, one of the finest in India. In his stage performances, Chick Chocolate mixed it all up. He would belt out swing tunes and Latin American numbers that the dancers loved. In his playing and the way, in his playing style and the way he comported himself on stage, he drew inspiration from one of the world's most popular entertainers, the American musician Louis Armstrong. Chick Chocolate, whose real name was Antonio Xavier Vaz, closely watched Armstrong's films such as High Society and Hello Dolly and The Five Pennies, and tried to copy his heroes' playing and singing as closely as possible. Before his concerts, he'd instruct his wife Martha to pack his case with at least half a dozen white handkerchiefs so that he could mop his brow in true Armstrong style. At the end of the evening, he would sink to his knees and raise his horn to the stars. This record cover, as it shows, Chick Chocolate actually did bear a slight resemblance to the trumpet player from New Orleans, who was his idol. Most often, the musicians who appeared in film sequences like this were actors who were fake playing their instruments. But while the appearance of Chick Chocolate and the music makers on screen was unusual, The use of jazz and Latin rhythms was quite common in the Hindi films by the 1950s. In some cases, Latin American melodies were blueprints for compositions that would be given South Asian ornamentation. Many of you will find this tune familiar, for instance. Anybody knows what the tune is, what the melody is? It's Kisas, Kisas, Kisas. So, as some of you figured out, that's a South Asian refashioning of Kisas, 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 the Cuban tune. So how did swing and Latin American elements come to influence Bollywood? That's a story I try to tell through the energetic, enigmatic characters in my book, Taj Mahal Foxtrot. Chick Chocolate, of course, was one of them. My book opens a little 2 decades before Albela was made. It opens in 1935 in the ballroom of the Taj Mahal Hotel in South Bombay. On stage is Leon Abbey. He's a violinist from Minnesota, and he's here with his band. Leon Abbey caused a sensation among Bombay's elite when he came to town. At a time when jazz had gained popularity in many parts of the world, Abbey brought to India the first band it had led, staffed entirely by African Americans. To Bombay's elite, Abbey's band was performing jazz that was more authentic than the music they had previously heard by multiracial outfits. Creating musical history in distant lands seemed to rank high on Abbey's list of priorities. In 1927, he'd taken his band to Brazil and Uruguay, giving audiences in Rio and Sao Paulo and Montevideo their first taste of hot music, as it was called at that time, straight from the source. Performing with Leon Abbey's band was a singer named Myrtle Watkins, who had achieved some prominence and more than a little notoriety, performing in Spain and in Cuban-themed bistros in Paris in the previous few years. And we'll return to her story a little later. Leon Abbey's band landed in a city that was rising to its feet after the global economic depression that had started with the Wall Street crash of 1929. Buildings were coming up everywhere in Bombay, many of them in the new Art Deco style that had come to characterize the jazz age around the world. My favorite Art Deco building in Bombay is this one, Liberty Cinema, which uses a piano keyboard as its primary motif, including here on the facade. As swing music became popular across the world, it was only natural that it would find its way to Bombay pretty soon. As a port city and one of the largest cities in the British Empire, Bombay had sought out the latest trends from other parts of the world since the 1860s, when the city made its fortunes trading cotton. For performers from the US and from Europe, travel to Bombay and then onward through Asia was accelerated in the 1870s after the Suez Canal opened. This is a period that Philippa Vicent describes so engagingly in her book, Other Orientalisms. Opera groups from Italy were visiting Bombay in the second part of the 19th century. In 1922, a Parsi merchant decided to fund Bombay's first symphony orchestra. New music trends from other parts of the world would first arrive in the subcontinent in that period on shellac records played on gramophones. But it wouldn't be long before musicians would make their way on the circuit to perform these sounds on the stage. All of the colonial world, luxury hotels have served as the places where local elites were served up a taste of culture from the metropolitan centers of the West. So just like Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo and Raffles in Singapore, the Taj Mahal in Bombay prided itself on giving Bombay society the opportunity to savor the latest trends from around the world. Its menus reflected the latest culinary fashion, and the hotel had also taken upon itself to showcase the cultural phenomena that were in vogue. It established the permanent Taj Mahal Orchestra in 1907. This is a photograph of the Taj Orchestra from 1935 when Leon Abbey came to town. There are no recordings of Leon Abbey in Bombay, but we know from newspaper reports that he played a solid mixture of swing and rumbas that he'd learned on his travels in Latin America. Though Bombay's elite welcomed the chance to foxtrot the music that had caught the fancy of their counterparts in many other parts of the planet, they complained that the change was too rapid. This is what the Times of India said. His style was so new when Leon Abbey first played for us that many diehards insisted on simpler tunes and popular numbers. Their quick steps have slowed from Paris speed, the fastest in all the dancing world, to Bombay speed, the newspaper said. They have toned down their hotting to meet the less sophisticated tastes of Bombay. But the starchy paper of record largely seemed to approve of Abbey. It said that the band is teaching us in Bombay what rhythm really means. Leon Abbey seemed quite amused by this controversy. One old-timer I met who'd actually interacted with Leon Abbey told me that he said, first they swore at my music, then they swore by my music. In the African-American press in the US, the spread of jazz across the planet was reported on quite extensively. Foremost among the publications that wrote regularly about the spread of jazz was the Chicago Defender, which had been founded in 1905 and became so influential in the African-American community, it was called the Black Bible. By the 1920s, the Defender had a full-time columnist in Paris. His name was Edward Wiggins, and he reported in the music scene in a feature called Across the Pond. It wasn't surprising then that Leon Abbey's doings in Bombay also received a notice in the Defender. They carried this picture of his band under the headline, "Introduces Swing Music in India." And the caption said, "From now on, the snake charmers will play swingy tunes for their fifes," after hearing swing music for the first time when Leon Abbey and his American band opened for a long engagement in a Bombay nightery. And that's a word we don't use so much anymore, nightery. This is them actually looking at a snake charmer. I'm not sure he's playing swing music or jazz. But despite the adulation they received in Bombay, Leon Abbey and his musicians decided to leave after a 6-month season at the Taj because, like so many Western visitors to the subcontinent, they found the heat too much to take. But Leon Abbey's visit had whetted Bombay's appetite, or at least the appetite of Bombay's elite, for performances by African-American musicians. So the band was replaced by another outfit led by an American trumpet player named Cricket Smith, who had been performing in Paris and came to Bombay. The most famous member of this outfit was a piano player whose name was Teddy Weatherford, who had come to some prominence in Chicago in the 1920s. He would end up staying in Bombay for more than a decade, eventually dying of cholera in Calcutta. By then, he had become so popular, press reports estimate that more than 40,000 people lined the streets as his casket was being carried to the cemetery. The success of these bands, led by Cricket Smith and Teddy Weatherford and others, were a magnet that attracted even more musicians from the Americas and Europe to India to find work. Among those who made their way to the city was the Cuban drummer named Luis Pedroso. You can see him standing back there. And this guy, a trumpet player named Luis Moreno, who was noted for being able to hit really high notes on the trumpet. Together, these performers played a vital role in creating a jazz and Western music dance culture in India. Though the musicians had been performing though Indian musicians had been performing swing music since the 1920s, they had learned to play the music, reading music scores and listening to records. Having these American musicians in town was like having a master class. Both Cricket Smith and Teddy Weatherford recruited Indian musicians to play in their bands. They not only helped the local musicians understand the technical aspects of jazz, they also helped them learn the jazz attitude, to improvise without inhibition. This is a picture of the band at the Taj from 1937, with both Indians and African Americans. Not surprisingly, many of the men, the Indian men in that picture, they were from Goa, with roots in the territory 500 kilometers south of Bombay that had been a Portuguese colony for more than 400 years before the jazz craze. By the beginning of the 20th century, Goans had earned a formidable reputation to the subcontinent and even beyond for their talent for playing Western music, and this has been the subject of Susana Sardo's research. Goa had been captured by the Portuguese in 1510. By 1545, a system of parish schools was established, which in addition to teaching reading and writing also included musical training. The contestations and interactions of Portuguese Goa, which Angela Barreto Xavier has charted so perceptively in her book, Religion and Empire in Portuguese India, spawned a range of syncretic forms, many of them sonic. There was the stately mando, the earthy dekni, and a stage form influenced by opera buffet, known as theatre. Kenneth David Jackson presented examples of this in his fantastic series, The Journey of Sound. Let's listen to one of the most famous deknis, performed here by a musician of Goan origin, Gonzago Coutinho, who was born in Mozambique and now lives in Portugal. So that was probably, that's the most famous technique, you think? Yeah. So the musical talents of the Goans came in handy when they sought work in British India. By the 19th century, Goans had established themselves as the musicians of the Raj, staffing the orchestras that performed in gymkhanas or social clubs established by the British administrators, and also by the courts of some Indian Maharajas. In Bombay, Goan musicians took over both ends of the music business. They were performing in these symphony orchestras, but they were also performing, they also dominated the street bands that played at the weddings and other festivities of common folk. The Bombay local historian Teresa Albuquerque writes how the demand for Goan musicians was so great that one ingenious chap named Francisco Menezes trawled through Goan neighborhoods to find unemployed men to march in the processions, instructing them just to hold the instruments to their mouths, inflate their cheeks, and not blow a single note. In addition, as India developed a fascination for the movies, Goan musicians played in the pit orchestras that conjured up the soundscapes for silent films. When swing music became the rage across the world, it was only natural that Goan musicians would begin to perform it, as they performed other popular styles that had come before. But for some Goan musicians, jazz was special. They seized on it as the song of their souls. Frank Fernand, who had played with the Cricket Smith Band, told me, jazz gave us freedom of expression. You play jazz the way you feel. Morning you play different, evening you play different. Soon enough, Indians were leading bands at the Taj, like this guy, Mickey Correa. He started to lead the band at the Taj in 1939 and stayed there until 1962. Like so many other Indian bands at the time that performed Western music, he never made any professional recordings. But here's a section of a scratch recording that his daughter gave me. It's made on a spool machine. The vocalist sings in Konkani, the language that's spoken on India's west, in parts of India's west coast. So that was a Konkani cha-cha-cha. By the 1940s, Bombay had a vibrant dance scene, sustained by people like this. And it's not so easy to foxtrot in a sari, I believe. In 1949, a concert program listed all of these bands in Bombay, dance bands in Bombay. There are more than 60. They start with the Alexander Band and end with the Zoroastrian Symphonians. But it wasn't all fun and games in Bombay at the end of the 1940s, especially if you were a jazz musician. Partition in 1947 had brought hundreds of thousands of refugees to Bombay. Among them were scores of swing musicians who'd made their living playing in the cantonments and hill stations in parts of Punjab that had suddenly become Pakistan. Suddenly in Bombay, there was a lot of competition for jobs in the Western music sector. In addition, prohibition had gradually been introduced in the abstemious Gandhian-influenced Bombay state. So hotels were losing business. But also jazz musicians were uncertain if the new India had a place for them culturally. Everywhere there was a suspicion of cultural forms that were considered colonial hangovers, and jazz was one of them. That's when the movies came to the rescue. Quite by coincidence, technological developments in this period allowed sound in the films to become much more sophisticated. Until 1931, Indian films had been silent, and in the early years of the talkies, the music was recorded by only a small group of musicians, such as these guys, all of whom clustered around a single microphone. But to effectively convey the drama unfolding on screen, film soundtracks need large orchestras with many musicians playing together to emphasize the urgency of a car chase, to highlight the suspense of an impending murder, or to serenade a sweetly developing romance. And here there was a challenge. That's because Indian music is melodic. The main performer plays a single melodic line, and everybody else reiterates that line. On screen, that would sound really thin. But Western music, as you know, is harmonic, it's polyphonic. The musicians in a band or an orchestra play notes of related pitches, which is what makes the group sound full and effective. Now, most of the composers of Hindi film scores, who in India are known as music directors, were trained in the North Indian tradition, which is known as Hindustani music. They had a fabulous talent for creating memorable melodies, but to be translated into effective screen music, these melodies needed to be harmonized for an orchestra. This is where the Goan jazz musicians came in. Because they had received their training in the Western tradition, they were among the few groups in India who knew all about harmony. So the composers of film music would hire these Goan musicians as assistants to help them with their scores. This is how the work would proceed. The producer would organize what they called a sitting. In Hindi, it would be called a baitak, at which a composer, who was often a Hindu, and the lyricist, who was often an Urdu-speaking Muslim, and the arranger, who was often a Roman Catholic Goan, they'd flop down on comfortable cushions to listen to the director narrate the plot. When the director indicated a point at which a song was necessary, the composer would hum a melody or pick it out on his harmonium. It was the assistant's task to note down these fragments, which the composer would later piece together into an entire song, the assistant would add the parts for banks of violins and cellos, the horn section, the piano, the percussion. In the West, he would have been called an arranger. He arranged the parts for the various instruments. But the assistant wasn't merely taking dictation. It was his job to craft the introductions and the bridges between verse and chorus. And so, drawing from their bicultural heritage and their experience with the jazz bands, the Goans gave Bollywood music its promiscuous charm. They would slip in slivers of Dixieland Stomp, Fados, Ellingtonist doodles, cha-cha-cha, Mozart and Bach, whatever caught their fancy. In addition, a great many of the musicians in the early Hindi film orchestras were members of swing bands. That's because while sitars or flutes or the other instruments were often the lead instruments, the bulk of the instruments in the orchestras were clarinets and trumpets and violins, instruments that provided harmony. For an orchestra to be able to play together effectively, the musicians need to be able to read notation of a score. But Hindustani music is an oral tradition and doesn't have a formal tradition, system of notation. So the musicians who played the Indian instruments couldn't read scores. They had to keep rehearsing their parts repeatedly until they memorized them. But The jazz musicians with their Goan musical training in the Paris schools were all fluent music readers. And this made the music recording process much more efficient. Soon, the orchestras in the film studios weren't looking so different from the bands that had played at the Taj. Here, for instance, is a picture of a guy called C. Ramchandra, and his assistant was Chick Chocolate, who we spoke of before, who you can sort of see on the side. Jazz and swing then had become significant elements in Hindi film song, but they were by no means the only exotic elements that swirled around in the studio. There were also influences from the Middle East, from Hawaii, from Spain, and as we heard, from Latin America. As we've seen in the previous clips, Iberian influence are not just, influences can't only be heard in the Hindi films. You can also see them in the choreography and in the costumes. Bradley Shope, in an essay, has delineated how Latin American cabarets that were popular in Bombay venues in the 30s and 40s influenced the look of the Hindi film song. He notes that Hollywood films with Latin American themes were popular with Bombay's elite. These American films featured actors from Latin America and South America, such as the Mexican Dolores del Rio and Carmen Miranda, who we were discussing earlier, from Brazil. These films, Bradley Shope writes, influenced the entertainment approach of jazz cabarets in Bombay and other Indian cities. And the Hollywood films with Latin American themed cabarets, in turn, provided material for the more of the Hindi film industry. Here's another example. Anybody knows what this is? The melody? So that was actually a film from 1950, and the actress name is Bhanumati. She's wearing Indian clothes, but that melody is straight out of Carmen Miranda. It's a song called I Like You Very Much. In my book, the chapter about jazz performers working in the Hindi film studios is titled Music Without Birth Control. It's a reference to a remark made by the Bombay composer of Western classical music, Victor Paranjoti. And this is what he had to say about in an essay about Hindi film music. He said, it may be crude, it may be born out of wedlock, but it's dynamic and vital. Nonetheless, he believed that film tunes would never fully satisfy the aesthetic hunger of Indians. The new Indian music he was seeking was a music of miscegenation, he said, and lay on the road between Bach and Palestrina on the one hand, and Granados and Rimsky-Korsakov on the other. In art and culture, Victor Paranjoti said, there is no birth control. Because I am a lazy person and work at a glacial pace, it took me far too long to finish my book about miscegenated music. But after I sent the manuscript off to the editor, I realized I had a bunch of stories in my notebook that I had been unable to include. A feeling I'm sure many of you in this room have had. Because I had structured my book around a few characters, I was left with a clutch of tangential stories that didn't fit neatly into my linear narrative. So a few months before the book was released, I decided to start a website. I thought it would be a place to put up some of the material that was lying on the cutting floor. And I'd add a few audio clips to give readers a sense of what was happening. But before I knew it, the website had taken a life of its own. I realized to my great delight that there were people aged well into their 80s in various parts of the world still Googling the names of musicians they'd known in India half a century before, or that they had themselves performed in India in the 1930s and 1940s. And every few days, I'd receive photographs from that period or long messages annotating the material that I had posted about. In addition, record collector geeks in Australia, in Germany, and Italy began to send me digital copies of Western music, shellac discs of Western music that had been recorded in India that they'd painstakingly acquired over the decades. For about 6 years, the website seemed to generate its own material, turning itself into a bit of a sound archive. Oops. The comments section was a special joy. After I wrote about a Hawaiian musician named Tau Moe, who'd performed in pre-independence India, some members of his long scattered family made contact with each other in the comments section and eventually held a reunion. This repeated itself with a Filipino family named the Evangelistas, who had spent more than a decade performing in all places in Jamalpur in Bihar. And then the descendants of a Bengali immigrant to the US, a chap named Bardu Ali, who'd been a notable presence in the Harlem scene in this same period. His relatives had another reunion. There were some quite disconcerting moments, though. Two people left comments saying that the musicians had written about were their fathers, but they hadn't been acknowledged. Many of the anecdotes that my far-flung correspondents mailed in deserved perhaps to have been books by themselves. For instance, the India correspondent of the Spanish newspaper, La Vanguardia, asked me to help him find more details about a Spanish musician named Francisco Casanovas, who'd arrived in India in the 1930s and ended up staying for 27 years. If you knew him only by the records he cut when he was in India, you wouldn't think very much of Casanovas. They're mainly corny dance tunes that he made when he led bands in the dance halls in Calcutta. But soon Casanovas was appointed the principal of the Calcutta Music School. He conducted symphony orchestras both in Bombay and Delhi. And when the violinist Yehudi Menuhin came to India in 1952, it was Casanovas who was the conductor of the concerts. The most intriguing bit of speculation about Casanovas is that after the Nobel Prize-winning poet Rabindranath Tagore wrote the Indian national anthem, he turned to Casanovas to help him write the score for the orchestra. Several Spanish websites have repeated this claim, and it's also repeated on that very authoritative site, Wikipedia. But there's nothing to really corroborate this, unfortunately. We do know, however, that Casanovas was among a small clutch of composers in the 40s working in the Western classical tradition who were seeking inspiration in the structures and approach of Indian rag-based music. The Vanguardia journalist sent me this tune that Casanovas performed in Barcelona in 1951. It's titled Obertura sobre temas indios, an overture with an Indian theme. Let's listen to a small bit of that. And it goes on for about 12 minutes, so let's cut it there. Yeah, and then there was the mystery of Paquita, who we met with the Leon Abbey Band. A record collector from Germany sent me some tunes recorded in Calcutta in 1941 by a duo who called themselves Paquita and Zarate. But I was unable to find out very much more about them, except for this photo montage in which they're dressed in Mexican costumes. Samuel Zarate in a mariachi outfit, and Paquita in a flowing dress with a giant eagle embroidered in the front. This is one of the tunes they recorded in India. It's called South American Way. So that then was what Paquita and Zarate sounded like. But then I read something in the story about this Mexican couple that sort of confused me. According to a discography in a jazz geek magazine, Paquita was actually the name of Myrtle Watkins, the African-American singer who performed with Leon Abbey in Bombay in 1935. The photographs that I had of Paquita and of Myrtle Watkins at that time were too indistinct to actually be able to make a clear identification either way. As it turns out, there was a lot more information about Myrtle Watkins in the archives than there was about Paquita. She had been described as the Josephine Baker of Spain and came to some prominence in Europe between the wars. In 1938, the New York Amsterdam News reported that Myrtle Watkins had married an Indian named Lal Singh. She has accepted the Hindu faith, and in the streets, she affects Hindu Eastern garb, the report said. Lal Singh, it turned out, was actually a cricket player from Malaysia who had played for the Indian team. And that made the whole story even more intriguing. In an interview a few years later, Singh's relatives said that he had fallen in love with Myrtle Watkins when she performed in Bombay, and he followed her to Paris. He even opened a nightclub for her, they claimed. 3 years after I wrote a piece on my website wondering if Paquita was indeed Myrtle Watkins, a woman from Newport, Oregon, popped into the comments section to say that Paquita and Zarate, after performing around the world for 3 decades, had moved to her area, Newport, Oregon. In 1959, they started a cultural center providing musical instruction. My correspondent said that she had been Zarate's piano player from 1961 until he died in 1997, and he'd left her all his papers. They included his marriage certificate from 1944, confirming that the woman he married was indeed Myrtle.
Wow.
In Newport, many people believed that Myrtle was actually Indian, an impression strengthened by the fact that the restaurant at their cultural center served Mexican and Indian food. So it turned out that after her relationship with the dashing Lal Singh ended, Myrtle had married Samuel Zarate, who was indeed Mexican. They'd met in Paris, where he was studying on a scholarship from the Mexican government. The woman from Oregon mailed me a fat stash of documents related to their time in India. There was even a letter from Wadia Movie Tone studio hinting at a possible collaboration. These papers helped me get a more vivid sense of the subcontinental entertainment scene at the time and the lives of the journeyman musicians who had sustained it. But it still didn't answer the question of why an African-American jazz and blues diva in the middle of her very successful career had decided to pass as Mexican. The stories of these musicians give us an idea of the different ways in which Iberian music was playing out in India during that period. As we saw from the film clips and the images of the cabarets, Latin American and Spanish elements, most often refracted through the lens of Hollywood, helped create a sheen of exotica that appealed to consumers of entertainment, the subcontinent. These rhythms and costumes helped transport audiences to distant lands that they were unlikely to ever travel to, or to imaginary places that didn't actually exist. But under the surface, Iberia played a fundamental role in catalyzing a form of music that wasn't immediately apparent to audiences. The invisible, unsung labor of the Goan arrangers and musicians in the film studios was an essential part in the process that sparked an era that came to be recognized as the golden age of the Hindi film song. I've tried to explain why I'm fascinated by this period of Hindi film music history. I tried to do that in an essay some time ago. To begin with, this was world music that was being created in the film studios every day, long before the term had actually been invented. But just as significantly, this music echoed the dreams of newly independent India. Hindu composers and Muslim lyricists and Roman Catholic Goan musicians were sitting down together every day, demonstrating through music that it was actually possible to find a way to bridge India's seemingly vast differences. I'm going to end with a curiosity from the tail end of that era. This was a tune that was created by musicians who made their living in the film studios, though this album wasn't a music soundtrack. In 1968, as the bossa nova of Antonio Carlos Jobim and João Gilberto captured imaginations everywhere, a bunch of Goan musicians were contracted to record Brazilian and Latin American standards, with a sitarist playing the melody. Some clever producer figured out that since the Beatles had popularized the sitar, perhaps this album would break into Western and South American markets. The album didn't exactly set the charts on fire when it was released, either as Sitar Goes Latin or Sitara Latina, as the cover said in the Argentinian edition. But 5 decades later, it's been rediscovered by hipsters in Latin America, and they're willing to pay quite a lot of money for it. When last I checked on Discogs, someone was offering a copy for $250. So this then, once again, is Quizás, 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 perhaps, 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 a song laden with the hope of possibility. To me, this track is a reminder that there's immense potential in the process of cultural exchange. But not everything that emerges is necessarily profound. Sometimes it's just plain fun, and that's necessary too. Thanks.
Would you like to take questions? Would you like me to gather some?
Whatever.
Comments?
Good.
It's on YouTube.
Wait. There's a comment, there's a question.
No, not a question. I just looked it up. The album is on YouTube. We can all listen to it.
Yeah, you can. You
Oh,
can.
great.
But as you can feel, it's sort of a very skippy version, and I didn't realize that until just now. So.
I want to thank Naresh for this wonderful presentation, and also thank you because you again earn a lot of time with some explanation that you already made here. Thank you. And I have a question for you because you mentioned many times that this is how Western music or jazz enter into India. I wonder if it was in India or Bombay, because it's not an Indian reality, no?
So through Hindi film music, it sort of becomes a different thing, and Indians recognize this. But I've been astonished at how jazz bands were all through the country, like that Filipino family. They were in Jamalpur in Bihar in the 1930s. So, for instance, that family, the Evangelistas, were in the Railway Institute, and they would play there on Saturday, and then they would spend the rest of the week going up and down on the railway line, playing at a different establishment every day of the week until they came back. And so it seems certain that this music was being performed in these sort of institutions across, and people of all classes were listening to them. If you weren't in, you were listening from the margins. I think it really permeated, but it became its own thing because of the Hindi film song. And as you know, sort of Hindi films have a variety, the song has a variety of registers. And often there's what they call a cabaret scene. And the cabaret scene is almost sort of a straight off jazzy song. So I think and the same thing replicated itself in the South Indian film industry, where composers were also using similar, but you're right. I mean, it was perhaps, it was more than Bombay, but it was perhaps
the production means were particularly in Bombay, no?
Yes.
Because they were spread through all India, but Bombay was so cosmopolitan, so that.
So Bombay was where the musicians gathered, and the most sophisticated recording studio actually was at Dum Dum in Calcutta. So everybody went to Calcutta from across Asia. Iranian musicians were coming to Calcutta to record music. So.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Naresh. It was wonderful. I was wondering whether, I mean, you were talking about how Western music was being appropriated by Indians. How did the British play a role in this coming of Western music? Because you are talking about Americans, Latin Americans, but not the British. And I was just thinking this idea that jazz allows a kind of freedom in the way of playing, how somehow this can be connected with politics.
So among the, and sort of I haven't elaborated on this in this lecture, but two musicians like Frank Fernandes, who famously said, morning you play different, evening you play different. They were deeply influenced by politics. And in Frank Fernandes, actually his life was transformed in the 1940s when he was playing in Missouri. And Gandhi landed up in Missouri because the Cripps cabinet mission talks had failed. And Frank Fernandes was in the audience. And 50 years later, he told me about what Gandhi said. He said, Gandhi said that there's a famine, that the rich should share with the poor. And I thought, how can he remember this? So I wanted to look, I looked it up in the collected works of Gandhi, and that's exactly what Gandhi said that day. He was so influenced by Gandhi that he was determined to find, to give jazz an Indian voice. And he worked at it for many years. You know, I mean, if you were a Roman Catholic Goan in the 40s, Indian music in some way was as alien to you as it was to Leon Abbey. So he began to take he began to seek out Hindustani musicians. And by the 1940s, we have no recordings of these and there are no scores, but we can see from program notes that Frank Fernand was playing a sort of Indian jazz. So deeply influenced by politics. People were and in jazz, they saw the music of liberation, of personal liberation and of political liberation. It wasn't the case for all of the musicians, but it was the case for some of them.
You just mentioned in passing about South Indian films. Can you talk a little bit?
I'm sorry, that's something that I don't know very much about, so I'm not even going to. But I have recordings of albums from that time.
I'm just wondering, were the people from north of Goa more influenced, and therefore there's more evidence of the coming together of music from Hindustani music and Latin America?
That's something Susanna can address.
The Indian tradition in Goa was, well, Goa is in the south, but the Indian tradition is from the north. So it was Hindustani music.
And there are sort of the great classical music performers from the north, and they still come from there. So.
Even today, it's like.
Naresh, this annotated archive is fascinating to me, like the afterlife of the project of the book. Can you say a little bit more? I mean, the generosity of people sending you these papers. I mean, one part of it is to say they wanted their stories recorded. These are really marginal lives. And, you know, you had this lovely phrase at the end, the kind of unseen labor of the Goan arrangers, which lives on as a reminder. But can you say a little bit more about this kind of archive that almost creates itself?
I was astonished that there were people in the 80s Googling, you know, desperately for somebody who had last performed in the 1940s. And this is completely amazing to me. But many of them had since sort of gone to other parts of the world.
Yeah.
They've taken their photo albums and they've taken their memories. And many of them, the older people who wrote to me, had written out the stories of their lives for their grandchildren, who would never know what India was like. So I received all sorts of sort of perfectly constructed narratives. There was a guy whose family, he was a swing musician, a Baghdadi Jew from Burma, who had done the trek to India during the war. And then his family, his name was Reuben Solomon. He made many records in India. Then he went to Australia and started a food company where his most famous product was Reuben Solomon's Hot Jam. But he sent me his recordings and his story. So it was sort of very, I would never know what I would receive from week to week. But it was also sort of incidental. One story would build on another story. For instance, my book is called Taj Mahal Foxtrot, because I think that's among the first sort of Indian hot records with an Indian theme. It was made in the mid-1930s. The musicians who recorded it were the Americans, but the composer was a Bombay Jewish man, a guy named MESAAS. I wasn't able to find very much about him. And over the years, it's sort of all sorts of MESAAS. His children got in touch with me, sent me photographs of him. MESAAS also in Bombay seems to have written tunes for hire. If it was your daughter's birthday, you would commission him to write a tune. And a whole bunch of people who he had written tunes for then began to mail in the scores of those. So it sort of just built incrementally. and helped me discover a little more about stuff. I'm glad it didn't come when I was writing the book, because I'm a horrible journalist and I want linear narratives. And this stuff was just going all over the place. It was complicating the story.
It's like every historian's dream to have a growing archive.
Great, thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.